Good evening, everyone! Welcome to another Disc Guidance segment with the 2MK team. Today we are showing off our KOF bot. We've shown our IoriBot efforts before, but today we have an IoriBot complete for you. If you're not familiar with how our bots in general and how these streams therefore work, I'll give a brief explanation. Bots are simply a matter of taking all 5, most games will give you 5, all 5 recording slots and using them up in a specific way to create something similar to an AI, but the purpose of it is to repeat certain things, just with enough randomness that you keep on getting the chances to do punishes, face the same situations over and over, and so on, but that you're actually being tested on your reaction spacing and similar instead of just practicing against literally the same replay every time. Our website will give you better explanations as to how to deal with exactly all of it, but I'm also going to be talking about some of that during the stream, as that is normally the format. So, the stream will normally be me talking for a little bit about why the bot is the way it is, sometimes some contrast to the CPU version if you try to turn that on, and explaining anything you especially need to know about the meters or options that the bot will have. This will move into an explanation of what your goal is, briefly, but without much explanation of how to achieve that. Then I will talk about the inputs required, though those will be released on our website later. Some people like to have a visual aid that's longer than what we put on the site, or even just like to basically get the bot early by just listening to me and inputting it on their own. Since King of Fighters is not a game that saves a bot's inputs between uses of the game, we have gone for a relatively simpler input schema, as we do with games like Under Night and Melty Blood. The result is that we also have a couple of characters that can be used with this bot, even though this is strictly speaking just supposed to be for Iori. It is relatively lower level in terms of what it does and what you are trying to do against it. I'm a little congested today, but probably not too bad. So, if you can manage to deal with the way I'm speaking now, hopefully this will be a useful and helpful stream. This is basically a bot for getting used to playing KOF as a whole. When you're not sure you're good enough yet, just input this and let it rock. In fact, a large part of its purpose is explicitly that. One of the main things you have to learn, first of all, is how to punish correctly, so that your opponent doesn't just bully you forever. Whether this is because the player quote-unquote smells blood, or simply because they don't actually know what is a bad idea or not, one of the main things you have to do in games at the beginning is figure out how to deal with it. I've never figured out why that keeps on being put back on. But it's probably okay occasionally here. Your goal against the IoriBot, therefore, or in this case, goals in general because there's 4 of them, revolve around mostly punishes. He's been given a lot of relatively serious offensive options, and in fact doesn't even use his fireball. But the important ones are pretty easy to see. He uses this claw, which, depending on its spacing and the pushback, means that your character might need to use certain longer range moves and he will usually block long enough that you will be able to learn at least sometimes whether or not that is a consistent thing you can actually do. He's not currently being particularly blocking, but you'll see a little bit later. Secondly, he does have that rushing, that move you've just seen there. He will sometimes do parts of it and sometimes not other parts, and of course this is also going to be range dependent. Punish that move. Whatever works. Because of the way that the hitboxes in this game interact, it can be very important to figure out whether or not you have certain options for punishes at different ranges. You do not get a point for punishing that, but you can, of course, like everything else, learn what you know or not against it. And unlike games where we normally tell you, learn to punish sweep, no, it doesn't matter here. It's useful if you can, so you can test out your options, but because sweeps are so different in this game from character to character, learning some relatively universal punish because sweep is a relatively long move isn't necessarily going to be as helpful. What you really do care about, though, is the fact that, of course, he will jump. In this case, if you input it correctly, he will sometimes jump and sometimes hop. In both cases, you want to get him out of the air, and some relatively advanced stuff will allow you to get an additional point, which is basically you counting to 10. The bots are all designed around this concept that if you can do the things required in 10 times in total, you have probably advanced enough, especially if you can do it consistently. But that brings us to the last thing you are supposed to get the points from. It's harder to get the points because it is much rarer. You've noticed that at times Iori will actually do his uppercut after the claw, and there are other times you can get him to do it if you interact with him correctly. But in general, this move is relatively easy to punish because you have so much time, but learning how to do it optimally can take a bit of your own effort. You don't get points for blocking that overhead, but it does help to learn that it is an overhead and that you should block it. Bots do often contain as much as we can manage to get in about standard tactics. The ones that people will just mash or that the CPU could do. So that you have to learn to interact as much as possible. Speaking of the CPU though, let's take a look at that. In general, we tend to make bots that will not do the things that the CPU does. This is helpful because it gives you a different option altogether. You can move to the CPU mode, which you do, I believe, by setting it here somewhere. I might be wrong about this one though. There we go. CPU controls level 1, 2, 3. What does this one go to? We're going to throw in 3 for now. In general, if you are just getting used to the game, this is the best place to start. But you are generally wanting to do this alongside the bot. You know, just to occasionally see a fireball. But understand that for the most part, either because it is reading your inputs, or slow, or not really trying that hard, the bot is often just as effective, if not more effective. And you'll get more out of learning when you've done something unsafe against the CPU. But you can learn that from other players. They will generally be happy to teach you. And in those cases, you won't even necessarily get that much, because players do better than that as well. Still, general familiarity with facing a character can be at least enhanced somewhat. We generally suggest starting with the bot though, so that once you've learned the punishes, you're not feeling stuck. As you can see, the CPU takes a while to actually do certain things, and it acts relatively illogically. You can't necessarily say the bot acts logically, but at least you understand its options a lot more than you understand why certain things happen here. If we change it to CPU level 4, you might get a little better in terms of what the CPU will spend its time doing, but generally it's still not necessarily hard to outmaneuver it. It just does more things in more gaps, and KOF in particular is relatively... what's the word? It spends more time getting damage on you than it does teaching you things. Because that's more or less all the AI that the game is given tends to be able to do without being completely overwhelming. Whereas bots have the purpose of being completely overwhelming, but in very, very clear-cut ways. I can't necessarily call them predictable, because we can definitely get them to the point where they're not terribly predictable. But you could at least say, I know it's not going to do this thing, ever. It might have 3 or 4 options from a specific spot, but you can also be reasonably sure that that's your limit. It's not going to just do things you've never seen before, or counter you in ways that generally aren't possible for a human. So, while this is helpful in a lot of ways, that is not the sort of thing that most people can do. And therefore, you'll spend less time learning in the way you probably would want to. That said, of course, if you find this to be the more helpful way of learning things, it's right there. You don't need the bot from us at all. So let's go back to the bot for a quick discussion of point systems and the requirements in terms of meters and so on. I think this can be set to nearly anything, because as long as we hit play, it doesn't matter. There we go. But we have to change a setting or two, in fact, in order for this to be correct relative to bot work. In general, this is another game where you would simply change your own health recovery to normal. And as always, 2 players' life gauge is always at auto recover, because you're practicing combos, you're practicing doing a lot of damage. So, given that the bot is not going to try to fight back all that hard, it's just going to repeat the things we told it to do, you don't want it to fall. You're counting in your head 10 times. In this version, you can start the 2-player at gauge less than 5, but because he doesn't overwhelmingly use the gauge, all you have to do is make sure it's not set to limitless. There are other bots, probably in the future, where setting it to limitless will be the thing you want to do. But for here, you could set your own to limitless if you really wanted to, because you don't get more points for more damage. You get more points. You should be keeping track of points relative only to your success at solving the problem. So we hit L1 and Iori's back on. The other way to do this, if you can get really good at recognizing things, watching your side of the screen, which is another good form of practice, is simply, do you see punish come up, or do you see counter come up? Technically you don't care if you see counter or not. The question is, when down near your own meter, once you press the button, did you see the word punish or not? If you didn't, it means your opponent had the opportunity to do something. Now this doesn't necessarily mean that you shouldn't count the point. That's up to you, depending on the situation. And sometimes, depending on what you're trying to do, the answer will be that you're supposed to counter. You're supposed to, and here, for example. And a lot of the time that will count as a counter and not a punish. But for those things that we were talking about before, the overhand claw and the various rushing punches, your goal is to see the word punish. If you input the bot particularly well, you will always have the chance of Iori just doing the Yaotome super and you have to deal with it. Because that has enough invincibility that if you mess up something, you're still in trouble. A quick explanation about the theory for the game itself before we go into bots. If you find that you don't have a normal that punishes something, check for an EX move. And that's about all I can tell you. It's the best way to figure out things, because the game's design is heavily based around using your EX meter to defend yourself when your opponent is playing particularly well. Your opponent does not get away with what they did, but they get the benefit at least of forcing you to use up your meter in order to do it. It can also get you very used to block stun and other things like that you're going to really need when fighting against people, particularly online. So even though the bot is not terribly complex and you spend a lot of time defending against it, in fact technically you can get all of the points against this bot without ever actually attacking it. These are still important things to know. Let's therefore go into the actual inputs and related things. Unfortunately, I have not found a way... Wait, that might be my fault actually. Sometimes the game does not give you the option to see the key data, the inputs from the bot side. And yes, I was remembering correctly that King of Fighters does not show you this either. You cannot get to check your work or anything like that when putting in the key data. I'm going to change characters briefly, mainly to play one of my own. Which I think changes the music. Yep. She doesn't reach as well. But in the meantime,
let's go!
you can see here why it's useful to not get the bot to take damage in specific situations. Or rather, to not die from the damage you do. And of course you can simply restart by pressing whatever button you use every time it comes up. But that little bit was mostly to demonstrate something else. Let's briefly go into how recording and playback works as a generality. Step 1. If you're using a controller, you often want to set some button that is easy to hit and not necessarily to hold, actually, for the record button. But I like to use L1 because I just do. Play and repeat can be placed on L3 and R3 because you don't need to hit those very often during the recording phase at all. And that allows us, this keeps on turning on, that allows us to do some recording. I'm actually going to re-record a lot of things, since you already could check back to the beginning of this to see what you need to see relative to whether or not it's actually working as expected. King of Fighters offers us a little bit better than a lot of games of its type, with micro-control in a lot of places. So even though I have all of these set to play right now, I'm going to show them off just by themselves. And with the recording off so I can't mess them up. I should probably make him not walk around so much. Stand is fine. So we're replaying just the slot 1. I'm going to explain these without explaining how to record them first, because there are some people who are used to these streams and only need to watch this far. This one is played out as crouching, heavy plus light punch. First frame, which in this case means hold those buttons before you actually press the recording button start. So the one direction, in other words, what is down back for Iori, it will be down forward for Shermie, so if I hold that, it's still going to show as down forward on Shermie's side. She might move if I press forward for a moment. I'm not actually recording, but you would record it by pressing down forward on Shermie, holding, as you can see it's there, noting how long I've been holding this button. If I press L1 and recording actually starts, the game will treat it as if I pressed all 3 of those things, the light punch, the heavy punch, and the down forward, as the very first frame of the recording at the same time. In this case of this recording, you will want to hold and continue holding the punches, and then do what would be a quarter circle forward for Iori. You'll see here that it actually shows you that the punches are present on every frame. And at that point, you would hit the end recording button, while still holding all of that. And the result will be that you will be playing back like this. And the reason why Iori is not hitting the punch, why he hit it once and not again, is because as long as you have held the punches the entire time, the game is treating it exactly the same as if I do this. I have to release the punches in order for Shermie to actually do another punch when I press them again. And the same thing applies to Iori. He's just doing the down forward motion because he's been doing this the whole time. At the moment, unfortunately, that's the best I can give you in terms of showing you inputs, because again, the game is not actually going to let me show them off from that side. Moving on a bit more quickly then, the second input would simply be a quarter circle back, again from Iori's side, and light punch. That's it. The difficulty in this input is usually making sure that you get everything clean, which is hard enough in itself, and making sure that you hit the light punch just before you end the recording. Because depending on how your fingers are set up, your hands are set up, you might not actually get that result. You want to end the recording fairly quickly afterwards, so you can hold this, tap the start, then do the motion, and then hit the light punch, and then quickly hit the record button again. The result should be this. That's technically it replaying into itself repeatedly, and that's why he does the entirety of the move. When it plays in conjunction with something else, for example, it would be different because now he is doing both a quarter circle forward and a quarter circle back at different times, and the game's lenient enough to let this come out as his super. For this, we are holding down forward for Iori, in this case down back for Shermie, 3, tapping a heavy kick, just tapping it, and then doing a backdash. So from Iori's side, just remember that I'm doing this from Iori's side because Shermie is going to forward dash. But after that you would want to do a jump, a very quick jump. A forward jump with a down back quickly. Something that looks approximately like that, although I didn't actually get the jump part, so I'll try to demonstrate it again. The quicker you are at this, and the cleaner you can be putting in less and less inputs, the more likely you are to get that hop you just saw, and the hop is what you are in fact aiming for. So on screen now, you have, if you can look around Shermie's waist, the correct crouching heavy kick, quickly double tapping what for Iori is a backdash, then a jump, and then a down back quickly to make it into a hop, as you saw. The result will usually be a lot of backdashing, so let's let Iori play that out. This has to do with the animation time. As long as Iori's backdash takes that long, you would have to interrupt him, and you have to interrupt him in a very specific timing to see any of the other inputs. You are not actually holding that heavy kick the whole time, though you can. But as you can see, the kick is actually in there. He will kick if you let him, but he'll just look like this unless I catch him at the right moment. And then he'll just switch to doing this instead because of the animation line. It does not matter as much whether or not that hop actually hits you, because while it would be good for it to do so, the training doesn't require the move to actually hit you. So it's fine if the hop timing isn't perfect for landing the hit. But you will sometimes want to make sure that there is a hop and not a full jump, because it will make a difference in your own training later on. The fourth input generally requires you to do just a forward light kick. In this case, I will do this. And again, you can hold it at the beginning, tap the button, and then just do this afterwards, and end the recording again. The purpose of this is to give the beginning of an uppercut motion. Uppercuts are a 6-2-3 motion. In this case, I got a 3 in there on the way down, but you just want to end it at that down input. And if you've done it right, he'll start to do this, because it's also very lenient about whether or not you actually get the uppercut motion by ending at down forward or ending at forward. So as far as the game is concerned, it's replaying 6-2-3-6 light kick repeatedly. And if I add in slot 3, which has a down forward heavy kick, there is a condition under which he does the heavy version of the move as well as the light. This may not always happen for you as a player. You shouldn't worry too much if you don't get the heavy version, but it's usually in there. And that increases his unpredictability because he will do both of them at different times. The final input is relatively simpler as well. You can start by just holding the heavy punch and heavy kick buttons to blow back. Tap the button to start the recording, and then do that. The jump part is required, and it's much better, much more effective if you make sure, but again you can't make sure of it because you can't see the inputs cleanly. If you make sure that you passed through, down, forward, and forward on the way through there. It's also best if you don't get any neutral jump input in it, but it's not the end of the world if you get the neutral jump in there. Still, you may find yourself needing to fix it if you do have the neutral jump, because the character may spend more time doing that than you want them to. Depending on your control scheme, just find whatever is best for you in terms of making sure that you get the up forward, what you see on screen right now. This sort of setup is better. It does not specifically matter much if you hold this or not. Specifically the heavy punch and heavy kick. But if you release it, you will have more options of this type. and he will have more options when hopping. So if you need the opponent to hop more to be more active, you should make sure not to hold those buttons until the end. You just let go of them somewhere in the process of recording. And you'll get this sort of thing. If you hold it, you'll get more so what you'd expect from the first input, where he kind of just hops occasionally and doesn't seem to do much else. So now I'm going to go into explaining two separate things at the same time. The first is the fact that you can use this for other characters. And the second part is generally just being able to use specific bots with specific changes. Here we are. You understand that against Iori your intention is to punish things. But we can use it for King as well, with less of an intention of doing that. And one more note is that you can turn the recording slots off altogether when you're doing these. You do have to manually move from one to the other while doing it, but in this case we'll leave it off because we don't want to record. We've got everything set up to be played right now. In our case, we like to move the buttons back, turn back off, play and repeat. And generally you can do that by pressing down on the same button. So for safety, in fact, let's do that now. And then change the repeat button to whatever you were using as your starter, and off you go. In this case, we're going to be teaching a separate concept altogether. When using the exact same inputs with King as your opponent, she will be a lot less forward mobile and spend more time zoning you and just randomly hitting specials in neutral. This is pretty useful if you are the type of person who thinks that you like move forward too much without focusing on whiff punishing. She does a lot of things that can be whiff punished, and I chose Whip because Whip as a character has moves that are slow enough that you have to actually whiff punish for sure. You can't have decided, I'm just gonna hit buttons and hope it hits her before King actually does something. Whip needs to move into the correct position, wait for King to do something, but her animations are so long that if she did not do it in the correct timing, it's likely that King will move and actually cause you some harm. We won't be going through every single character that this works for, because there are lots of things that make it work or fail, specifically timings and the animation lengths of certain moves. For example, Iori will tend to do all of the moves correctly because the amount of time for the inputs is tuned toward Iori's moves. Whereas King can get into loops like this where she mostly just does Venom Strike and backdashes because of the animation time of the Venom Strike itself. It is, however, easy enough to understand what's happening here. She still has the hop, but her moves are different enough that defense isn't what you need to do anymore. You can do just defense, but she will tend to back off after the same sorts of situations. This game is, however, helpful in that you can use the same thing to tell you whether or not you have succeeded at a whiff punish, because it does not require that you are actually blocking to do the reversal style punish or to see punish on the screen. It will tell you that you have succeeded at a punish as long as your opponent was in recovery frames at the time you hit them. But in this case, counter is also useful because depending on what you were doing, it's still the correct hit. Because she is so much less likely to move forward than Iori, and so much more likely technically to jump backward, or dash backward, rather, you spend a lot more time learning to get in and understanding spaces for such things. And for characters like Whip who don't necessarily have immediate strong advances of their own, the same sort of thing happens. But the hop is in there and will then help because she will occasionally go on the offense, and you could benefit more from stopping it. This is not, however, the sort of bot where we have the level required to say, here's a point system. This works as King Bot 1.0. It is simply a useful way for you to train something different without changing inputs if you, for whatever reason, tired of doing IoriBot and wanted to change a pace, quite literally. The blowback attack is also in the right place, but I don't really have a good way to show you what this looks like when things are not correct. Time for another shift, therefore. I'm looking for a character that I play that has a good jumping light kick. Mary will do. I guess I can just go back to her. And we should probably finally change stage. Now, that's probably enough for anyone who just wanted the bot. It went on a little longer than usual because, as is often the case with our first bot for a game, we do need to explain a couple more extra things. There'll be more complex and more in-depth explanations about things like first frame recordings and precisely how to get the inputs you want on our website when the bot is released, but for now, I'm going back into talking about how to achieve your goals at least a little bit. One thing that works well for those who are familiar with games that have a throw combination button, usually light punch plus light kick. If you're an anime player, it's usually A plus B. Street Fighter is again light punch plus light kick. Those sorts of things are important because if you don't have a single button for throw, you can sometimes mess certain things up. But in other games it can give you very slight advantages, and here's one of them for this game as a generality. One thing that often helps against opponent hopping is to do that. But that means that you could press the equivalent of an air throw button if you were used to air throwing in other games at that sort of space, and use that as your way of dealing with the problem. If you press the button too early, for example, and don't leave the ground, chances are you will have hit either a light punch or a light kick, in which case it's fine. If you did hit them together, you'll at least roll, which is pretty useful. So if your timing isn't good enough to be sure that you left the ground and instantly hit the button, like that, then you can come up with more useful methods of dealing with your problem. You'll note that Iori doesn't necessarily jump that much though, and when he does, he can easily get ahead of you. That move only works if you were very quick on your reactions. But it's also a useful way to teach you when you do it too much. If you are the type to hit your anti-air or air-to-air before your opponent really needs to do anything, you've just guessed that they haven't actually left the ground yet, hitting the light punch plus light kick will often give you some better information on this, particularly if your character's light punch or light kick in the air is an actually good air-to-air situation, as just demonstrated there. Similarly, Iori demonstrates that a properly timed blowback attack will just beat this cleanly. But blowback isn't always something you can afford to do. I mentioned earlier that there is one additional point, but it's part of a separate thing, so it's more of a secondary version of a point. One thing you'll realize as you get higher and higher in skill in this game is that people will not let you get away with jumping at them. If they have figured out a way to knock you out of the air, particularly with the same sort of thing, they can perform a relatively difficult feat of execution to create mix-ups. It depends on where exactly in the hit you collided, but in general, if you've got it right in terms of timing, you can hop directly after having knocked your opponent away with your air-to-air attack. And while many characters can respond to this, especially if they were too high in the air, there is definitely situations where you can beat someone out with that of your own, and then hop, and if they were going to stay defending, you may get some advantage. Hyper hops in particular allow you to cross up and similar. So this is somewhat worth practicing, even if just because you might eventually get enough of a benefit out of it, just as a general thing from hitting people in the air. Of course, I am just mashing it because not only have I not practiced it. Ah yes, playing like a real online Yuri.
Player 2 wins.
But let's demonstrate this properly then, with that in mind, because you may hear me count for a point if by some chance I manage to do this. But I haven't had that much time to practice, so it's probably not going to happen. This, for example, no point. This is just me mashing light punch after a move that technically doesn't even give points for punishment. Technically, if anything, that was just a waste of my energy. This, on the other hand, if I were to have punished correctly there, then it would count. You, the player, are the one who decides, did you do enough? When you're first starting out, just being able to respond in time at all is meaningful. But once you've gotten better and better at it, you might not want to do it that way. That, for example, is interesting because most people don't reach from here, but Mary's Mary, so she doesn't care. With certain timings and spacings, she can in fact just punish with just heavy punch. But you'll notice that it doesn't come up every time. So I am mistiming this at certain points. I could mash it, but that's really not the point either. There are other aspects that come in here as well, as for example where and when Iori hit you, how far away he was, which hitbox component of the move struck you, and all of these things are part of did I actually punish that move or not. So let's say that I'm looking for a specific level of punish. And what I want is to do, let's say, stand heavy punch into EX spin fall. This is not a place to do it, because I would use up my meter at a point where I don't get the point for the punish. There, I would have had to confirm that it was a punish, but that one was just a counter. You can see how this would be a decent explanation of how to deal with this in a real match as well. Again, once I've hit the button, I can check, quickly get my eyes to the bottom of the screen and see did I actually achieve a punish or not. Now we don't necessarily suggest never using the meter for the quote-unquote proper punish. If Iori did do a specific move, just got his super off, and especially if you've got extra meter, use it, because you will want to be able to do that in matches. You shouldn't risk conditioning yourself to hold back against those types of mistakes. But at the same time, understanding that your situation has changed is important. And you'll notice I just basically let him jump at me 3 times, because I'm so focused incorrectly now. This is the sort of thing that you practice, in our case we practice generally for hours, because it will give you something. And because this game has such, let's say, tight block stun, you want to get really good at understanding, did I actually do what I intended to do, or would my opponent have just blocked that? That, for example, was a real punish, so I would give myself 1 point. That was also a real punish, but it doesn't matter because while I'm getting very good at practicing doing that, I don't count it. That wasn't a punish, so it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter as much if you don't actually count them all correctly. Let's say that Iori does the overhand flame, and I don't actually do the correct move, or I don't do it quickly enough. More so the latter, because if you did the wrong move and it was still a punish, that's up to you to decide how important that was. But if I didn't actually get the punish perfect time, mostly what will happen is that your opponent will block your punish, and sometimes that's not so bad. But as you improve more and more, as you fight harder and harder, it becomes more important to be able to do that accurately every time. And I suppose it is easy enough to see why one would want to practice these things. The randomness of the bot does allow you to sometimes get a lot of points quickly by him just doing the same thing that you're used to punishing over and over again. But then there are other times where he'll just refuse to do it for long periods of time, and you have to deal with it entirely differently. Reacting to hops is difficult enough as it is, but sure, we'll add more and more difficulty in terms of doing it by making the bot faster in this way, so that you can get practice against higher level players doing similar things. Because they have an entire, usually very fast game plan already on deck. So you gotta be ready to be faked out in neutral, to need to land punishes that you couldn't land normally, to be able to anti-air at that spacing that you just saw, and to be ready enough to actually do it. Yes, he also has a toss-up fireball. Of course, just anti-airing normally should still give you a point. You just can't get the second one. In order for the second part of that to be a point, you must have done an air-to-air, because otherwise you wouldn't really be practicing the quote-unquote correct thing. So here I am, you'll notice quite often end up waiting for him to do this so that I can at least try a punish. But that will only work out if he chose to do it enough times that I could get what I needed. Meanwhile, my opponent is jumping at me as much as he likes. There's one point of it. Thankfully, we've realized you can get a lot more out of this bot than you can from many of our less powerful first bots in other games, without it being completely overwhelming, because you get so much choice in this one as to how much effort you're really planning to put in. If I want to make sure I get the punish down for the other action before I even try this, that's fine. And if I want to make sure that I anti-air or air-to-air every hop or jump, that's just as good. I find myself questioning whether or not that involves a micro walk, for example. If you don't know what that means, just ignore it. You can use this sort of thing to learn frame data as well. And one good trick here is simply, you don't know for sure that the same move punishes both the light and heavy versions of that, for example. You do get some practice at whiff punishing as well if you really want it. And therefore we consider the whole thing relatively successful bot-wise. Unfortunately, it's really difficult to say how exactly to get the inputs right. If you're not quick enough, the bot will be a little bit less effective. But this is seemingly the best we can do in terms of making sure that the things you want to do are understandable enough to get away from the problem. If you have a character with counters, you can also use them as a good way of learning what is done, because Iori will use multiple moves of that type. So I'll close up this stream with brief demonstrations of that for all you Geese-Howard fans out there. I'm still getting used to this back dash, let's call it. Really? I love it, but at the same time. Anyway, moving on. So here's one more special use of this bot. He does just enough of everything that if your character has multiple different counters, you can test them. For example, I could have assumed those were going to be lows and gone for the low counter and got some information. So it's a good way to build up that specific type of skill, because it takes a while to get used to. This is the thing I should hit for precisely this move. And of course, you will get pummeled every time you get it wrong, unlike the other situation. Timing matters just as much. For those who are not familiar, I believe that specials and leaping moves are countered with uses like kick counter. Normals and mids are countered with the heavy kick counter, and lows are countered with the low counter, which is a quarter circle forward instead of a half circle forward instead of half circle back, with the light kick. Just count that as bonus content, because it's not really important otherwise. I know he has something he can do against, I think, jumping normals have to worry about the heavy counter, but I don't always remember. The EX counter is even harder to understand, so I'm not going to go into that now. Basically, we're done for the day, so that's a whole lecture to give. If you're interested in it more so, feel free to look it up. I was pretty much just telling you, you can use this to check some things.
Player 2 wins.
I believe that brings us to the end of this disc guidance stream. Hopefully the bot is easy enough to input. We will be releasing it at the usual time at 7:30 Eastern on Sunday on our website 2-mk.org under the KOF bots section, which probably does not exist anymore. You can verify that we did or did not do this by checking our Twitter 2_MK_FGC. At the time, 2 will probably let you know if there's any problems. Let's discuss any delays and so on. But overall, this has been really important to 2MK. Good luck with your training and good night, everyone. I leave you with